Number 10. Aphrodite and Lemnos. Kicking off this list, we have some pretty tame punishments. Definitely cruel to say the least, but more on the non-lethal side of things, as gods' sakes go. Apparently the gods love to be praised. Yeah, they're awesome. But sometimes they do some foul stuff. The goddess of beauty herself, Aphrodite, gets pretty pissed when she's not obsessed over. And the women of the Isle of Lemnos were kinda slacking on the prayer department. So she cursed the people of the island with a foul smell. I mean, that's pretty mean. Everybody stinks sometimes in life, you know. It's life. Little musk never hurt anybody. But apparently the stink was so bad, all their partners left them and they were quite upset.
Bruh.
Which I can understand. It was probably just the equivalent to like the Great Stink in Europe, you know? Bodies and carcasses on a hot grease day just heating up the water and stinking it up. But nope, now it's a curse. Poor women of Lemnos probably get that rep for a while, you know? Stereotypes, they're brutal. I don't like them. Also, little salt water under the armpits. Boom, easy fix. Number 9. Demeter and Asclepius. Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, and her hatred for a certain mortal man. A king, actually. Demeter apparently was out looking for her abducted daughter Persephone and was thirsty from running around. Naturally. She found a cottage owned by a little old lady named Hecuba, asking to wet her whistle and started drinking some barley juice. Thirsty as all Poseidon, she was chugging from all the running around. The son of the woman, just a little kid, basically was like, "Thirsty much?" Yeah, you don't mock a god, no man. She threw her drink in his face and turned him immediately into a spotted newt.
You're done. You're done.
Okay, couple things here. Little excessive, I think. I mean, what do I know? I guess you shouldn't talk shit, kid, you know? Talk shit, get turned into a newt. That's the saying, isn't it? Number 8. Demeter and Aracithin. Aracithin of Thessaly ordered all of the trees of the sacred grove of Demeter to be cut down. Yeah, that's a big mistake right there. Industrial logging. One huge oak was covered with beautiful wreaths, a symbol of every prayer Demeter had ever granted, and so the men refused to cut it down. Every other one, of course, yeah, let's go get that rustic log cabin look. Aracithin needed more wood, so he himself grabbed an axe and went out and cut down that last tree. He was cursed by a nymph, naturally, whose prayer had been heard by Demeter herself. Long story short, she was like, "You want to build and eat? No problem." Gave him the munchies of a lifetime. Non-stop hunger. An insatiable hunger. Guy ate everything in sight. He was so hungry, Guy started eating himself. Yeah, all of him. Look, I've been hungry and picked something off the floor, 5-second rule, no problem. But I've never garlic and buttered my own fingers. But greed is greed, firm but fair. Number 7. Sisyphus and Hades. Sisyphus was the first king of Ephyra. A cruel king. He killed guests and travelers in his palace, which was a violation of guest obligations, which fell under Zeus's domain, thus angering him. He took pleasure in these killings because they allowed him to maintain his iron fist rule. Zeus was really pissed, yeah, this guy was cocky, and he punished him for cheating death twice. But his younger brother, Hades, caught wind of this and was like, no. As a punishment for this trickery, Hades made Sisyphus roll a huge boulder endlessly up a steep hill, forever. Yeah, he was like, no, Zeus, I got this one. Brothers helping brothers. Hades then displayed his own cleverness by enchanting the boulder to rolling away from Sisyphus right before he reached the top, resulting in an eternity of getting jacked quads and hammies, and an eternity of uselessly, effortlessly, and unending frustration. That's really annoying. Number 6. Hera and IO. Okay, so we're moving away from kind of firm but fair and non-lethals to a little bit more and more cruel. IO was a beautiful woman to whom Zeus fell in love with. A married man. Ugh. IO was the daughter of Inachus, one of the river gods and king of Argos. She was living in Argos when Hera learned about this secret relationship, and she was a little hurt. I mean, who wouldn't be? Stewing in her sinister revenge, Hera turned Io into a cow to keep her away from her husband. You know, pretty non-lethal. Very mean, but, you know, fair. After being cheated on again by the same woman, she was like, alright, I guess that didn't work, and Hera was like, I'm done. She then sent a giant gadfly to sting Io continuously in cow form until she ran away, mad cow style, wandering from country to country, always being stung. Okay, I get this. You want to stop hanging around my man? You get stung every time, okay? Yeah. Bye-bye. Number 5. Hera and Heracles. Bless my soul, Herc was on a roll, and Hera, the queen of gods, was extremely jealous of that. All those other women in her husband's life. Zeus's consorts, and Hera hated the kids that came along with the adultery. One of them being, of course, Heracles, who puts the glad in gladiator, Hercules. Yeah, that's the same dude. I was a 90s kid. As the story goes, Hera caused Hercules so much trouble that he was actually driven mad on one occasion. According to Homer, just before Hercules was born, Zeus announced a prophecy that would make Hercules the ruler of the heavens in his place when the time came. Hera didn't like that so much. She kind of pushed the birth thing a little bit. Hera also made Herc crazy. Little bit of roid rage, you know? In a blind rage one night, he kills his wife and son under the rage spell of Hera. Part of this punishment was that the insanity was just temporary, so when he came to and realized that he John Wicked everyone, yeah, she had won. In sadness, he smashed about 12 labors and got himself back on track. Talk about zero to hero. Number 4. Arachne and Athena. Okay, so a little hex here, little labors there. The wrath of the gods is pretty tame so far. Well, was. And then there's the story of Arachne. Ovid recounts the very talented mortal Arachne, daughter of Idmon, challenged Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, to a weaving contest. Yeah, you don't challenge the goats to what make them great, you know? When Athena could find no flaws or errors in the tapestry, she was pretty pissed. When Athena saw that Arachne had not only insulted the gods in what she had drawn, but done so with a work far more beautiful than Athena's own art, she was enraged. She ripped Arachne's work to shreds, and terrified of what comes next, Arachne took her own life. Athena brought her back to life, cursing her after a little sprinkle of Hecate's herb, an ancient poison. Arachne's hair started falling out, and then her nose fell off, and then her fingers, as her whole body started slowly turning into a giant spider. And this is apparently now why we have spiders. Yeah, thanks to this epic weave-off. Number 3. Hera and Lamia. Lamia was a beautiful Libyan queen, and enter Zeus stage right. Of course, loved by Zeus. Yeah, basically through no fault of her own, she got the wrath of Hera upon herself. This dude's commitment skills leads these people to get in a line of fire with some nasty curses. Hera cursed this lady hard. Every time she gave birth to a child, Hera either murdered it or made her eat it, regardless if it was Zeus's or not. Hera was like, nah, never again, now eat it.
All of them.
Even babies that weren't hers. Basically every night Lamia would ravenously make her way village to village eating mothers' babies. That's horrible. She swore to bereave all mothers of their children just as she had been once by Hera. Trying to help, of course, Zeus gave her removable eyes so that she was blind but harmless in the day, but after she popped those bad boys in, feeding time. Hera's mean, man. Number 2. Poseidon and Pasiphae. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more into like disturbing graphic land with some of the more cruel things here. What started out as a rumor that some people were kind of smelly is turning into like eternities of pain and suffering and stuff. Pasiphae was a queen of Crete and often regarded as the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. The daughter of Helios and the ocean nymph Perse, Pasiphae is notable as the mother of the Minotaur. You'll see why. She conceived the Minotaur after mating with the Cretan bull. Minos was required to sacrifice the fairest bull to Poseidon each year. One year, Minos, king, refused to sacrifice his most beautiful strong bull and sacrificed an inferior weak bull instead. Dude, don't with the gods. As punishment, of course, Poseidon then cursed his wife Pasiphae to fall head over heels obsession lust for this beautiful giant prized bull. And
many months later,
Pasiphae gave birth to a half-human, half-bull creature famously known as the Minotaur. The curse was sent out as a reminder to her husband Minos, quality over quantity kind of deal. That's heartbreaking. For her, of course. Her husband's cheap, so she has to birth a bull. It's not really fair, I'd say. And coming in at number 1, Prometheus and Zeus. And our number 1 spot, of course, must go to the god of gods himself. He can be pretty shady. Cheating on all his lovers, fighting with his old man and his kids. He's a little unpredictable at times. This one, ramping up the cruelty, we have Prometheus. He was our guy. This demigod loved us and stole fire for us. He fought on our behalf. He led the Titans into a trap, securing power amongst the gods again. He was everybody's friend. Besides Zeus. Yeah, Zeus didn't like the tricks and the new plans and all the attention he was getting. So Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining the Titan god to a rock with the might of Zeus himself. And then, worst part of course, having an eagle day in and day out just eat his insides out. Basically just slowly eating him for eternity. He would heal overnight, but then come the AM, breakfast again for eternity. Okay, so a little humanity never hurt anybody except for poor Prometheus. Thank you for the wonderful campfires. We now have s'mores, they taste great. But Hercules is coming, buddy. He's gonna come save you. I've seen the last chapter, no spoilers alert. Well, there you have it, folks. 10 times the ancient gods got a little pissed and decided to dish out some justice themselves. I mean, I don't agree with like almost all of these. Turning a woman into a spider because she's a better weaver? Like, just admit defeat. Or like Robin Hooding for the good of people, only to be eaten alive every day by a giant bird? I don't know.
Number 10. Marriage.
More good women have lost to marriage than to war, famine, disease, and disaster.
I know some might think initially that this isn't a punishment, but in the cases of the Victorian women, the societal status of being a woman was only seen based off of the ideologies that needed to be pure and clean. Your bodies were seen as temples, and it shouldn't be decorated with jewelry, nor should it be used for physical activities or your own personal pleasures. You couldn't oppose men, and you being wealthy or a spinster was the only exception. Single women were looked down on with shame and pitied, and as your main purpose as a woman was to marry and reproduce. Even young girls at the age of 8 to 12 would stop working as if there was no child labor laws or protection laws for children, and as soon as these women or young girls were able to menstruate, they would be negotiated into marriage and no longer be able to sustain themselves financially or just be a kid. And being a poor married woman wasn't an option, as you had no individual rights under law. Married women were only seen as one with their husband, and the husband would be the manager and entitled to all of your properties, as it was seen more as a business, and you were being micromanaged constantly until death do you part. Number 9. No rights. As I mentioned with marriage, women didn't have any rights, as they were seen primarily as second-class citizens, and if you were a woman of color, my goodness, you were definitely seen less than human. Women who had to be married ended up losing everything they owned, inherited, or earned, and it would belong to their husband. Once a woman married, control of any property she owned as well as any income she received from it passed to her husband. Although he could not dispose of it without her consent, her property, her personal property such as money, or earnings or investments, and personal belongings such as jewelry passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his consent, and if you were in a loveless marriage or a harmful one, you couldn't divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even a concept for women to execute without losing their own amenities, even in the court of law until the 1970s, almost 100 years or so later, after the spark of the women's suffrage movement in the mid-late 1800s. So men had the right to divorce his wife under the grounds of adultery, but women had to prove her husband was unfaithful, combined with other allegations including cruelty, bigamy, incest, and so on. Luckily, in the 1857 Act, divorce did become a bit easier little by little, but again only under the impression that the woman had legal grounds and proof her husband was unfaithful, with evidentiary support to back up her claims. And even then, she could finally earn some of her possessions. As for the husbands, if he wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't have to do anything, he could just say it and it would be fine. Number 8. No education. To me, education is extremely important, as it was something I learned growing up in my family, that education liberates you to understand yourself, those around you, and the world better. And for women in this era, they were received less education than men. They were banned from universities and could only obtain low-income paying jobs, as she was not allowed to follow a profession, as they were all closed to women. And the irony of them having Queen Victoria as the reigning accolade of this era, a woman and women of these times couldn't get an education to liberate herself or her children from defamation if the husband no longer sees her as a useful asset. So for women, especially those who could afford it, was raised in a privileged household with financial backings and exceptional family background, her education was only seen as accomplishments. Like, oh darling, she's a very accomplished woman, is something you might hear in these type of movies that depict the era, which only indicates that she had artistic talents like singing, dancing, and knowing foreign languages, and anything to help earn them a husband and be a benefit in the house. Even doctors at this time believed that if a woman studied too much education, she would stunt her ability to reproduce. Wild as hell. And when university allowed women to attend their lecture halls, their families would actually forbid them from going, worried that it would prevent them from finding a husband. Number 7. The right to work. Work was only available to those who had no choice, as their societal status prevented them from leveling up to the ladder to have a better life independently. Even more so, women who were labeled as part of the working class, these women fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the working force in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Even more so, those who were labeled as part of the working class, women of this era fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the workforce in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Women that had jobs outside of the home made them less likely to marry, leaving them them with no choice but to stay in undesirable situations that made them undesirable themselves. In one study by the Buffalo State had noticed classing women and children together as helpless creatures needing the protection of strong men. They were indignant at the knowledge that women had to support themselves, that they had suffered degrading wrongs as working women. So for some, they'd have to result themselves into committing adult work, or even for some unfortunate circumstances, be sold into adult work, as they had often had heavy debts from predecessors or even used as bargaining chips for their partners. Poor women were not regarded as the Victorian society, as they could not fight back, as men had captured these women, straight up kidnapping them, and kept them at their house. Differences in societal classes led to some women being ignored and unacknowledged in society for economic reasons and for the pleasures of some men. Women of the night had no exits of this profession and were stuck in this life, and they would be beaten, tormented, as this was obviously shamed on, as well as being arrested, which would lead us to number 6. Number 6, women who were in prison. In some revolutionary standpoints, being in prison might make you look like a hero or a villain, as it depends on what you were doing or what you stood for. For the Victorian era, women who had been the most vocal at this time for a multitude of things like women's rights, the women who were caught in the act of selling their bodies in order to obtain financial means would be arrested and sent to prison. But even women who were not adult workers would be arrested. Women who had premarital pregnancies, truancies, or adultery, or kept bad company would also be arrested. They would be sent to prisons or reformatories, as for women of these times, a small step off of the Victorian pedestal made for a long fall. Women sent to prison in the Victorian England were subjected to regimes whose project was to enforce idealized femininity. This individualized treatment aimed at more regeneration than discipline, and was administered by an entirely female staff aided by middle-class philanthropic lady visitors. Considering women were placed only into two categories, being a wife and a mother, the reality is that they lived in a world that discriminated heavily against them. Due to their superior physical strength, men considered themselves the dominant sex and sought to keep women subdued for as long as they could. Number 5, prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution, but for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are silently identified, only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4, domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common, as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors and marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, in a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth, here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, Asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past. Number 10, King Pyras. King Pyras, who ruled the ancient Greek kingdom of Epirus, was also known as a brave and skilled commander, but his death at the hands of an old woman during the Battle of Argos in 2072 BC was far from the glorious end. The battle took place in a narrow city streets of Argos, and while Pyras was fighting an Argive soldier, he was hit on the head and fell from his horse. The Greek philosopher and historian Plutarch writes that the soldier's mother was looking down from her house, and when she saw that her son was engaging in a conflict with the king, she was filled with distress in view of the danger of her son, and lifting up a tile with both her hands and threw it at the king. It is not known whether he was killed outright or merely dazed by the blow. Either way, the enemy seized the opportunity and him. Number 9, King Henry I. King Henry I of England decided to indulge in a hearty meal of lampreys, a type of fish that looks like an eel and had circular mouth filled with rows of teeth. Although Henry was fond of the fish, the doctor advised him to avoid them because according to historian Henry of Huntingdon, they always disagreed with him. Henry ignored his physician and chowed down on the forbidden fish. Soon afterwards, they caused a sudden and extreme disturbance under which his age framed sunk into a deathly torpor. Henry I is not the only king to have eaten himself to death. Adolf Frederick of Sweden managed to do it in 1771 after eating copious amount of seafood and then tucking into a semla bun. Then another and another and another until he ate 14 of them and then having stomach problems and then dying. Number 8, the Duke of Clarence. The nobility was usually granted the honor of being privately executed rather than publicly humiliated, which means that their cause of death is sometimes uncertain. This is the case with George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who was executed for treason by his brother, King Henry IV. In 1478, during the War of Roses, as rumors soon spread that rather than being hanged, he was actually drowned in a barrel of wine. Although it may have just been false gossip, his unusual death is recorded in multiple histories. Fabian's Chronicle 1516, for example, mentions that Clarence drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, maybe drinking himself to death, but suppose his death of wine gained even more traction when William Shakespeare included it in his history play Richard III, 1597. In the play, Clarence is stabbed, but then one of his, killers declares, "I'll drown you in wine." but wine. Number 7. King Edward II. Edward II's rule of England was fraught with controversy, much of which is stemmed from his relationship with Piers Gaveston. The nature of the relationship remains unknown, although it speculates that they were lovers, maybe they were just roommates. Regardless, the English king's close bond with his favorite and poor leadership led to Queen Isabella and the nobility killing him. Many modern historians believe that he was simply left without food and water to die of natural causes. However, medieval historians claim that a hot poker was inserted into his butt to burn his bowels. In the Chronicles explains that this was also done as no apparent of any wound or hurt outwardly might have one perceived. Another account states that Edmund was killed by an assassin who hid himself in the toilet below and struck the king twice with a very sharp knife into the private parts, and leaving the weapon in his butt, and he fled away. Although it is benefited from his death, both Huntington and William of Malmesbury claim that it was an Englishman, Adric Sterona, who hired the assassin, and when he was subsequently executed for the crime, he breathed out his abnominal spirit to hell. Number 6. Emperor Valerian. The Roman Emperor Valerian ruled from AD 253 to 260 when he was captured in battle by the Persian Emperor Shapur I. As a prisoner of war, Valerian was subjected to humiliations, which included being used as a stepping stool from which Shapur would mount his horse. Sources vary in the description of this eventual execution, with the most gruesome tale being that he was forced to drink molten gold. An alternative story is offered up by an advisor to Emperor Constantine I, who alleged that Valerian was flayed alive and his skin was then dyed with vermilion and displayed as a warning to the Romans that they should not place too great confidence in their own strength. Although neither account is verified, drinking gold and being flayed alive are both very horrible, painful ways to go. Kinda like Game of Thrones where they poured gold on that one king. Number 5. Sigurd Estenson. The first Earl of Orkney was the leader of a Viking attack on Scotland, and while few details of his life made the history books, his unusual death certainly did. Although his attempted invasion of northern Scotland in 892, he agreed to an even fight against a royal steward called Malberget. Each leader was supposed to fight alongside 40 men, but Sigurd cheated by mounting 80 men across 40 horses. Sigurd won the battle, of course, and then tied his enemy and his head in a straddle as a trophy. The Norse history text reports that this was actually his fatal mistake, as he was known for being a bucktooth, a particularly prominently pearly white caused a wound on his leg as he rode. The wound quickly became infected and Sigurd died. His enemy may have been decapitated, but he may have revenge in death. Number 4. Emperor Valerian I. Valerian apparently died of a stroke after screaming in rage. Valerian was a Roman emperor from AD 364 to 375 and spent much of his reign defending the borders of the Roman Empire in Europe. Valerian met what a group of Quadi messengers, the Germanic people of the Romans have been fighting for a long time, to negotiate a ceasefire. The envoy maintained that the Romans had been wrong to build forts in their land and could not guarantee that all chiefs would cease their attacks. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman soldier and historian, wrote that Valerian that burst into a mighty fit of wrath, and that he once calmed down was suddenly speechless and suffocating, and his face was tinged with a fiery flush. Valerian had worked himself into such a rage that he actually gave himself a stroke. Number 3. Emperor Qin Huang. Qin Huang unified China for a first time, after which he took the title of emperor in 221 BC and then began his process of building the Great Wall of China. Alongside these huge achievements, he was also obsessed with trying to live forever. In his attempt to achieve immortality, his alchemists prepared elixirs for him to drink, but his habit of consuming wine mixed with honey and mercury led to his death at the age of 49. Mercury would have also followed him into the afterlife, as he was buried in the city-sized mausoleum guarded by a life-size terracotta army, which supposedly featured rivers of mercury. Until his resting place was discovered in 1974, it was thought that the writings of the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian greatly exaggerated the magnificence of his tomb, but he was proven correct about the huge number of clay figures and may also be right about the rivers of mercury. However, this will still remain a mystery until the technology is developed to enter the tomb without damaging the contents. Number 2. Duke Jing. Duke Jing ruled the state of Jin in the ancient China between 599 and 581 BC and died shortly after he abdicated due to an illness. According to the ancient text, the Zhuozhuang, Jing consulted a shaman after being visited by a demonic entity in a nightmare. The shaman told me that he would not live to taste the new wheat, and Jing struggled on, and when the wheat was ready to be eaten, he had the shaman killed for making an incorrect prediction. Either just before he tucked into the tasty wheat or just after, he suddenly felt the need to go to the washroom. It is unknown why, but Jing fell in and eventually drowned in a pit of urine and feces. Drowning in general in any way is a bad way to go, but drowning in excrement is particularly grim. The servant who fished his body out of the latrine also suffered a horrible death, as they were buried alive with Jing. Sucks. And finally, number 1, George V. George was the grandson of Queen Victoria and was responsible for the royal family adopting the name Windsor in 1917. He had been repeatedly ill since a fall in 1915 and didn't help that he was a heavy smoker and suffered from bronchitis. By January 1936, it was evident that he was ill for the last time and his royal physician was summoned. Rather than waiting for the end to come naturally, Dawson decided the king needed to die before midnight so the news would break in the morning edition of the Times rather than less appropriate evening journals. Yeah, this guy's a real one. Without the royal family's knowledge or the king's approval, he bumped him off with a lethal injection of morphine and cocaine. What's worse is that he may have struck again 2 years later as George's sisters, Queen Maud of Norway, was visiting England when she suddenly became ill. She survived the abdominal surgery Dawson performed but subsequently died of heart failure later after. Ominously, Lord Dawson reported to her Norwegian doctors that her death was a release which saved her from these last painful stages of the disease, which was apparently cancer. It's kind of giving a little Michael Jackson controversy, to be honest. Number 10, drowning. Drowning as a form of punishment was not a common practice in ancient Egypt, at least as far as historical records and archaeological evidence indicate. The ancient Egyptians had a legal system with various forms of punishment, but the various methods were typically less severe than drowning. But in records of the Code of Hammurabi, which was one of the oldest and known legal codes in human history, it provided a comprehensive set of laws covering a wide range of aspects of daily life, including civil, criminal, and commercial matters. One of the most famous aspects of the code is the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Mentioning drowning if there was adultery with a neighbor's wife, or if you had intimate relations with your daughter-in-law, more or less these punishments would go both ways, but interestingly enough, the laws depended on the person. Number 9, disinheritance. In ancient Egypt, inheritance and property rights were complex and evolved over time, with some variations depending on the specific period and social status of individuals. Generally, women did have rights to inherit property, but there was significant differences between men and women in terms of inheritance. During the early dynastic periods, women had relatively more rights and they could inherit and own property. However, as the society became more stratified and centralized with the rise of the pharaonic state, inheritance laws became in favor more for males. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, women's rights to property and inheritance were gradually eroded. Property, especially land, was usually passed from father to son. Women could gain property through marriage contracts, dowries, or gifts, which they could then pass on to their children. But if they lose their inheritance, so do their children. Thankfully, there was legitimate ways of structuring a will, making unequal distributions of disinheriting a person so to minimize challenges which do not involve corporal punishment. These include a gift conditional upon the recipient not challenging the will, a no contest clause diverting assets outside the will by writing a life insurance policy into trust, or passing assets through the will to a secret trust. Number 8, banishment. In ancient Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the legal system was complex and the punishment for various offenses could vary depending on factors such as the severity of the crime, the societal status of an individual involved, and the time period in question. Banishment was one possible punishment, but it was not the common form of punishment. Banishment in ancient Egypt was being expelled from a community or city was generally used for serious offenses or crimes. It was a severe punishment because it meant the individual was cut off from their community and likely left to fend for themselves in the harsh environment outside settled areas. And for women, it was typically a rare occurrence as the legal system in ancient Egypt was based on the code of law that changed over time, and evidence suggests that women could be subjected to various forms of punishments for their crimes, including banishment. Number 7, punishment. More commonly, punishments for women in ancient Egypt might have included fines, corporal punishments, or forced labor. For serious crimes, especially those that threatened the social order or involved treason, more severe punishments like execution might be applied, but in some cases for less serious offenses, women might be required to pay fines. These fines could be in the form of money, goods, or livestock. Women, particularly those of lower social status, could be sentenced to perform labor as a form of punishment. This might involve agriculture work, construction, or other forms of manual labor. Depending on the nature of the offense, a woman's property or belongings could be confiscated as a form of punishment. As mentioned earlier, banishment was a possible punishment for serious offenses. Number 6, beatings. In ancient Egypt, like in many ancient societies, corporal punishment, including beatings, could be a form of punishment for women, particularly for offenses that were considered serious or morally reprehensible according to the prevailing nature and culture and legal norms. It's important to note that the application of punishment varied depending on factors such as societal status and specific time period and the region within ancient Egypt. Corporal punishments such as whipping, beating, beating, or other forms of physical punishment could be administered for various offenses. This might be more common for crimes like theft or adultery. Examples would be like switches, flexible branches, or vines could have been used for beatings. They would be capable of inflicting pain without causing severe injury, as wooden paddles with a flat surface could also be used for beating as well. They would also have been effective in delivering blows to specific areas of the body, and the simplest form of beating would be involved with the hands and fists. This method would also be easily accessible and wouldn't have to require any specialized tools, as well as whips, sticks, and rods. Number 5, strangulation. Now for the more morbid section on this list, although stoning may seem like a common thing in this era as a form of capital punishment, whereas an individual is pelted with stones until death actually was not common associated with ancient Egyptian legal practices based on available historical and archaeological evidence. The primary method of execution in ancient Egypt was typically strangulation or impalement. Stoning as a form of capital punishment is more commonly associated with other ancient cultures in the region, such as ancient Mesopotamia or parts of the Levant. In these societies, stoning was indeed known as a form of capital punishment for various offenses, including adultery. Strangulation was one of the most common methods of execution in ancient Egypt. It was typically used for serious offenses and could be applied for both men and women. In cases where capital punishment was deemed necessary, strangulation was a method employed to carry out the sentence. Number 4, lacerations. When it comes to corporal punishments, as I mentioned above, those who do commit adultery might deal with the consistency of beatings or lacerations. Texts speak of thrashing with a wooden stick give 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 or even 200 times. They also mention branding and mutilation of the nose and ears. Tomb reliefs often show beatings of people, but in most cases these are private coercions of subordinates, not an official penalty. Sometimes the culprits are bound to a pillory. These punishments were all carried out in public and therefore also meant a loss of honor and degradation of the culprits. The results of these measures can be seen on many skeletons, as they are also including cutting off limbs, noses, and other parts of the body as a form of punishment, specifically connected to adultery or if you were married, specifically a married woman. It is a crime deserving of death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. The husband had a legal right to punish or forgive his wife or leave the court if the husband accuses the wife with no proof. The punishment of a man was much lighter, and the woman of the crime of adultery, as the Egyptians believed, that offense falls primarily in the hands of the woman, while the women would be killed as the men would severe just 1,000 blows. Number 3, burning alive. Referring back to the Code of Hammurabi, the code was enlisted under the morals and the laws in ancient Egypt and Babylon. When it came to intimate relationships with your close family, you'd be subjected to many listed punishments, as in dealing with seduction or physically harming someone intimately. The Hammurabi inflicts the penalty of burning if you were to have a physical intimacy with your mother, but since this was ancient Egypt, unless you were a royal who needed to pull an Oedipus complex to maintain your rule and connection to the monarch position, it wasn't something looked down on but normalized, as this is a civilization that needed a monarch rule at all times to guide the nation. But it is good to note that it was a typical Western interpretation that this era was prone to burning alive people, when the irony was that the Europeans burning women, being witches or even more heresy, were more burned. Number 2, head be gone. The ancient Egyptians set harsh punishments for those accused of treason or corruption. The death penalty was usually applied by impalement, thumping, or a 100-fold fine, and this applied to both men and women. The decree also referred to the death penalty for someone who steals an animal belonging to the temple and transfer it to another party, while confiscating the property of the thief in favor of the stolen temple. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between the stolen goods and bear the attribute of holiness and considered it a religious crime that requires execution, and those stolen goods that do not affect the sanctities, settling for the penalties of beating and the fine for the theft 100 times of the value of the stolen items. Number 1, buried alive. Of course, all of these leads to death eventually, as the punishments were drastic, dangerous, violent, and vile. I mean, if you somehow survived the beheading, then what a miracle that would be. But death was only reserved for the extreme measures of punishment for women of these times. As I mentioned, there was very minimal, if not just the common punishment of corporal punishment. The scariest, in my opinion, would be buried alive. In some cases, individuals might be sentenced to be buried alive, although this was likely a very rare extreme form of punishment, most likely only reserved for the ones with extreme cases of crime. It's important to keep in mind that our knowledge of specific cases and punishment in ancient Egypt is limited, as much of what we know is derived from inscriptions, legal texts, and other historical records. Additionally, practices may have varied over time and in different regions of ancient Egypt. The legal systems and punishments evolved over the millennia, so there could be variations in practices depending on the specific period within ancient Egypt history. Violence against women is a human rights violation, potentially touching on the rights to life, to equality, to liberty, and security of persons, to equal protection under the law, to be free from all forms of discrimination and violence, to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health, to just the favorable conditions to work, as well as the rights to not subjected to and cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. And although the cruelty and damages to women was abhorrent and tragic, it still lingers in our day, as now 60% of women still don't report crimes due to fear of shame and stigma. But we still need to be safe spaces to those who need reassurance so that they can speak up. We still got a lot of work to do, you know?
Kicking off the list at number 10,
boiling. Whenever I get in a bath that's too hot, I think of the medieval times. I can't help it. I can't believe this was once a real thing. I get chills thinking about it. Either water or oil would be used for this ancient punishment. To die by being boiled, that was reserved for those who poisoned others. So if you have any vials of poison, toss it. Don't do it, man. Trust me. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. So poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason. Therefore, it was agreed you should be boiled slowly in front of like a room full of people. I would say that's the worst, but I know what's also to come on this list. Number 9. Water. Taking a step away from the worst physical thing one could possibly go through, let's take a look at how far the mind will go before it too breaks. Sensory deprivation is still around today. In fact, there's many who pay for it. Yeah, they lie in a dark tub full of salt, then they float and listen to Childish Gambino. It's a magical experience. Your senses are powerful, especially combined with water, so this dripping machine, this old water punishment, that was just all bad. You had ice cold water dripping on your forehead and your face over and over for hours and hours. Drops would be at different random times so you can predict it as well. My toes are wiggling while I'm talking about this. This is making me anxious right now. In medieval times, they would tie you down and then using a horn, a big ass funnel, they would pour 9 pints of water down your throat. So water is horrible in many ways. Number 8, fire. Can't talk about medieval punishments without mentioning this witchy classic. Commonly practiced in Babylonia and ancient Israel, then later on in Europe with the classic witch hunts, burning at the stake didn't come from churches, like many believe. They didn't call the shots there at all. That was mainly how small towns settled local beef. Yeah, by burning at the stake, instead of just like a fist fight at the park. Burning at the stake came in full swing way back in 1431 in France. French disbelievers like Joan of Arc, they were burned at the stake. It was crazy that they actually did this as a form of punishment. This is one of the worst medieval punishments, and believe me, there's a little bit of a silver lining here. It was quicker than most. Sometimes. Gunpowder was sometimes used so that the burning and stuff would be much faster and brighter and louder and much more horrible. A lot worse on paper, but a lot faster. So honestly, I think it's better. History is insane. Another red hot punishment used in medieval times was when the accused had to hold a red hot iron bar and then walk a few steps with it. A red hot iron bar, your hands were literally toast at that point. Here's where it gets even worse though. 3 days later, the accused would come back to the court, and then when the bandages were removed, if their hands were healing, they started to heal, they were deemed innocent. They were on the path to goodness and whatever. If their hands were still in horrible condition from, say, I don't know, holding a red hot iron bar, then they were pronounced guilty. That's how the courts worked back then. Number 7, the rack. On to something not so hot and fast, but rather dull and slow. The rack is surprisingly well known. It was originally introduced to the Tower of London around 1420. The Duke of Exeter referred to this device as his daughter. What a weirdo. It's like guys who call their car like she. It's like, okay, just a little bit too close to your automobile, man. Relax. It was an open bed frame type device where your ankles were tied at the bottom and your hands were tied at the top. Already we're off to a horrible start. It was horizontal as well, and sometimes it was up. It was all bad. It would just leave you hanging by these ropes, and these ropes were slowly tightened more and more, obviously causing some problems to muscles and joints that were, holding things in place. This was done to extract information. This is also one of the worst things I've heard. Even getting tickled like this would be horrible. I couldn't even imagine. I make jokes because I'm uncomfortable. Honestly, hit that thumbs up to spread some good vibes because we're not even halfway done, folks. Number 6, molten metal. This was another form of capital punishment, and if you've seen Game of Thrones, it'll ring a familiar bell. A few of these do, actually. Yikes. Metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a long time to the point where it was liquid. It was molten metal, just a soup of minerals. Look, we said this video wasn't for the faint-hearted, and here at Bumblebee, we like to keep that promise. They would then pour the molten metal on your head, or more commonly known, they pour it down the throat of the accused. Obviously, it wasn't done as a method to extract information, it was done to brutally end someone's life. Because they're not talking after that, of course. Execution by molten metal was supposedly done to a wealthy Roman general, Marcus Licinius Crassus, back in ancient times. The metal would burn your muscles and skin, literally cooking it, and then after a few moments, it would harden. Bad, not good. Number 5. Keel hauling. Not to be confused with Kegels, keel hauling was reserved for the worst of the worst at sea. This was used by pirates for sailors who disobeyed orders and all that jazz. The victim would be suspended by a rope with rocks or weights around their ankles, then they're lowered to the keel of the ship where all the sharp barnacles live. After so long, these ships are so old, it's just piled on layers and layers of barnacles. Then they would get dragged all along them with the water and everything. Water plus pain, it's a lot, it's a deadly combination. Anything to do with barnacles in the sea, no chance. I'll literally tell you anything, Blackbeard. Anything. Number 4, solitary confinement. This is a kind of punishment that still exists in our modern society, but it can truly be one of the worst punishments out there because of the type of psychological distress that it causes. We were all just in a pandemic for so long. We got so bored and we had Netflix and iPads and whatevers. I can't even imagine this back in the day. Basically, it's a prisoner living in a single cell with little to no contact with anybody else. Not even like a guard or anything rattling keys like in the old times. It was just nothing. No one would even check on them. There are many stories about people being locked up for so long they forget about their families. And some people have gone away to solitary confinement for so long that once they're out, they just forget how to speak, really. They forget how to be a human and interact in the real world. Solitary confinement and the negative effects that it has on a person is becoming a wider topic of conversation because of the effects on a person's mental well-being, and it's a topic for a lot of human rights organizations. Back in medieval times, solitary confinement was literally just a room made of stones. It was pitch black, freezing cold, you were tucked away below some janky castle, and most of the time you weren't really alone. In the dark, nibbling away at your little piggies were, number 3, rats. Another Game of Thrones classic. If you're a rat person, I know there's a lot of people who do tricks with their pet rat. That's cool, but maybe cover Stuart Little's eyes for this one. Rats as a medieval punishment, where do I even start? Okay, this one was a punishment for the rats at the same time. What was once called a rat trap involved a man or woman being tied down to something, and then a metal enclosure would be strapped down to their chest or their stomach. Now inside this metal enclosure, there's rats, which are also just loose walking around, and the person can feel them, the little feet walking around in their skin. And this is when the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, it was hot coals that were usually placed on top, or there's a fire underneath, which quickly creates a hot environment for the rats inside. From there, the rats begin frantically searching for a way out, but because it's made of metal and they can't bite through that, they find your skin, and then that they can obviously bite through. So you can paint the picture in your head. It's disgusting. Number 2, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel is literally just a large disc, a pirate ship wheel almost, just lying there, where somebody is then tied to it and everybody else just hammers them and beats the shit out of them over and over. But of course, since we're talking about medieval times, everything has to be a show and whatnot, so once the accused was beaten and then presumed dead, the wheel would lift up and turn just to show everybody what's up. Another way to use the breaking wheel, yep, there was more than one, again, creative folks back then, they would tie a person to the wheel and then continue to rotate it, and then all the ropes below would get tighter and tighter and twist. Kind of like the rack, but with a literal twist. And finally coming in at number 1, the Brazen Bull. This one takes the rat's problem and then makes it a you problem. Out of all the ones on this list, the Brazen Bull is the last one that I would do straight up haunting. It's also been referred to as a Sicilian bull, and basically it's not too complex. There is a bronze sculpture, often in the shape of, you guessed it, a bull. But in medieval times, it was just a big closed cauldron, and usually it was large enough to fit a person inside. Yeah, this was in a Saw movie too, I believe. That's how you know it's a good one, when it's in the movie Saw. So once the person was locked inside or it was leaned over so they couldn't get out, a fire would then be set underneath this bull, and then you can probably figure out the rest in your head. They would even engineer the bull so that when somebody screamed, it sounded like a bull's roar. How fun is that? How fun is history? I'm learning so much about history that's fun on Bumblebee.
So we'll start with punishment 1, tattooing. You may have seen our video, the top 10 messed up punishments from the Tokugawa era, in which case tattoos as punishment may sound familiar. While Japan and China were on different wavelengths and doing their own things, this is something they had in common for criminals. Although tattooing has been known in China for centuries, it has been in the most part an uncommon practice outside of their indigenous peoples. Throughout Chinese history, tattooing has been seen as a defamation of the body, something undesirable, and this originates likely with the penal tattooing as one of the 5 capital punishments in ancient China. The first, and considered the lightest of the 5 punishments, had criminals' upper cheeks or forehead or other visible parts of the body tatted up. It was usually words that described their misdemeanors or the location of their exile or name of their hard labor camp. These tattoos are obviously permanent and very visibly marked out their bearers as ex-criminals for life. Even should the criminal ever return from exile, the tattoo would mark them as what they were. The Kinlaw Code covered so many offenses that common people frequently did not realize they had committed a crime until they'd been arrested. So you really could be just minding your business one day and boom, face tat the next. Next is amputations. So after tattoos, the next was rhinotomy, aka the snip of a criminal's nose. Like tattooing, it left the victim scarred for life. But because sharp items and blood were involved, rhinotomy and the next 2 penal penalties following after often resulted in death, even if not their intention, just due to things like bleeding out or infections. Then, level 3 is amputation of feet, aka you. Modern day scientists have been examining a skeleton that was found from 3,000 years ago where the foot of a woman was cut off as punishment for committing a criminal act. Various clues hint that the woman's foot was cut off as a ewe. Her bones show no signs of any disease that could have made such an amputation necessary, and it seems that the injury was roughly made, rather than with the precision of a medical amputation. There were variations in punishments in different periods where the choice of foot removed depended on the severity of the crimes committed. Amputation of the right foot for a very serious crime, and the left for lighter offenses. It would seem that the woman, who was determined to be in her early 30s when she died, had committed the former. There is extensive historical evidence of the practice of the third punishment, such as documents of a Chinese official in the millennium BC complaining about the demand to find special shoes for their amputee people. Remove the reproductives. Called gong, the permanent removal of a person's reproductive function. Male victims of this punishment were castrated, losing the member as well as their boys. A very famous casualty was Sima Qian, an emasculated father of traditional Chinese history writing. Gong punishments for female victims were harder, as in the older times they didn't really know what was going on all up in there or how to access it, so it might have involved pounding a woman's abdomen with a stout stick to introduce some kind of damage to the womb. Call that Wicca womb, I guess? But no? No, alright. Then the final in the code, the last of the 5 punishments was death, obviously. However, there were different variations of death, from simple strangulation or decapitation to boiling or grilling a person alive and making literal mincemeat out of a person's flesh and then salting it. They got gorgeous with it, guys. The cruelty was deliberate and designed to cause maximum pain to the victims and their families, as well as to shock and deter others from committing similar crimes. A criminal might be sentenced to death by strangulation if less punitive, or decapitation if more punitive. Strangulation was actually prescribed sentence for lesser crimes, lodging an accusation against one's parents or grandparents, scheming to kidnap a person and sell them, opening a coffin while desecrating a tomb. Decapitation was a method of execution prescribed for more serious crimes such as treason or sedition. Despite a great discomfort involved, most of the Chinese people actually preferred strangulation to decapitation in the ancient times, and this is the result of the traditional belief that the body is a gift from the parents and that it is therefore disrespectful to one's ancestors to die without returning one's body to the grave intact. Executions were usually carried out at 11:30 a.m. On the day of the execution, the convict would be carted from the jail cell to the execution grounds. The cart stopped at a wine shop named the Broken Bull on the east side of the Zuanwu Gate, where the convict would be offered a bowl of rice wine. The bowl would be smashed after it was drunk, oppa, and then the heads chopped off and promptly sent to the emperor. Now finished with the 5 official punishments, let's check out some other horrors, like the kangu, a type of large wooden collar placed around the necks of offenders, which could weigh differently depending on the severity of their crimes. Speaking of which, the Chinese Empire really said, and we have the receipts for it too, guys, as the criminals' past crimes would be attached to the wooden collar, most of the time for the public to see, grocery list style. The kangu also restricted a person's movements, so it was common for people wearing kangus to starve to death as they were unable to feed themselves and sometimes not even move from one place. If people were generous enough to offer food to the roadside kangu wearers, they could also see the list of their crimes and determine based off of that if they deserved their generosity at all. After all, it was a device used for public humiliation and corporal punishment. Imagine seeing someone you've beefed with forever pop up one day on the street corner wearing one of these. You can just walk up and read everything they did wrong, just attached to them. That's satisfaction for a grudge holder, man. Stand your ground until you can't anymore. The neck tower. This torture and execution was done in 2 ways, either in a tall narrow tower or in a tall wooden frame box. Either way, both tower or box could open only from the bottom side. A prisoner is put inside the wooden box frame or tower with only the neck protruding. Hands and feet would be shackled inside and only a towering pile of stones would be in there to stand on. However, each day, a stone or 2 is removed, dropping the prisoner lower and lower and lower by inches over the days, letting them die slowly by strangulation. Battle of the sexes with this torture, it's Zanzi, a form of crushing torture used to extract confessions or as a penalization for laws broken. Now may be a fun time to mention that the 5 laws of punishment I had just counted for you guys, those punishments actually only apply to men. For women, the 5 punishments are a different set and far less severe. First is grinding grain, second is the Zanzi, which you're about to learn about, third punishment is beating, fourth is confinement, but also sometimes, as mentioned, she got her womb smacked about a little, and finally 5, permission to take your own life. Not them killing you or telling you to do, no. This was some like side-eye, well, we're not telling you what to do, but you know what's up, ... type of thing. Anyways, the Zanzi. This finger crusher was a Chinese instrument of torture consisting of small sticks strung together with cords, which was then placed around the fingers and gradually pulled, causing agonizing pain inwards. Think being tricked into playing knuckle breaker by your older brother for the first time. Under traditional Chinese law, a person could not be convicted of a crime unless they confessed. The Zanzi was a legal and non-lethal torture method for forcing women to confess, and for men there was a similar and more painful Jiagun ankle crusher, which uses 3-yard-long wooden planks that slowly pulled and compressed the feet in an excruciating fashion that both broke tendon and bone. Time to snatch that waist ancient China style, the waist chop. Waist chopping first appeared in the Zhou dynasty, and sadly no, it was not truly a plastic surgery alternative to get that slim thick summer look going. In reality, it's when a prisoner is tied to a table, whether lengthwise or widthwise, it doesn't matter. However, it's definitely far less comfortable to be chopped in half while also awkwardly dangling your arms and legs off of a table. Anyways, lying face down, the executioner was to try being the key word, to sever the person in half using a large fodder knife at the small of the back. These big ass knives were literally so heavy, it was more like teetering forward and letting the blade kinda slam into the person and hoping for the best. Sometimes, most times, the chopping was not limited to one blow. A story from 1734 describes Yu Hongtu, the education administrator of Henan, was sentenced to a waist chop. After being cut in two at the waist, he remained alive long enough to write the Chinese character Chen, which means cruel, 7 times with his own blood before dying. After hearing this, the young Zheng emperor abolished this form of execution. I guess maybe after learning what happened to Hongtu, the emperor felt like half the man he used to be too. Huh? Yeah? We've heard of it before, we'll hear of it again. It's Ling Chi, aka slow slicing, a regular torture and execution to reoccur in Bumblebee videos due to how far spread this torture traveled, how much it was used, and just how overall disturbing it is. Slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE up until the practice ended around the early 1900s. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame, usually in a public place. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that was not specified in detail in Chinese law and therefore likely varied per empire or century. Generally, it consists of cuts to the arms, then the legs and chest, leading to the amputation of the limbs, followed by decapitation or a stab to the heart. If the criminal was less serious or the executioner more merciful, the first cut would be to the throat. The punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and as a punishment after death. To be cut into pieces meant that the body of the victim was not whole in the spiritual life after death, which is massively consequential to many Chinese people who believed reincarnation required being whole in death. It is described as a fast process lasting no longer than 15 to 20 minutes. The coup de grace was all the more certain when the family could afford a bribe to have the stab to the heart inflicted first. Some emperors ordered 3 days of cutting, while others may have ordered specific tortures before the execution for a longer execution. For example, records show that during Yan Chouhan's execution, Yan was heard shouting for half a day before his death. And finally, the 9 degrees of punishment are 10 shades of effed up. In the words of Mulan's Mushu, alright, that's it, dishonor on your whole family, make a note of this, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Well, the Qin dynasty and a few others of China really felt this sentiment with their whole chests, and it shows in the creation of the 9 degrees. See, the punishment involved involved the execution of close and extended family members. These included the criminal's living parents, the criminal's living grandparents, any children the criminal may have over a certain age, which varied depending on the time period and who was in control and what their definition of a child even was. Also siblings and siblings-in-laws, uncles of the criminal as well as their spouses, and of course the criminal himself. Imagine messing up so bad your whole family line just gets annihilated. We all have that cousin or sibling who would have screwed all of us by now if this still happened. A famous documentation of the 9 degrees is the story of Fang, a Confucian scholar famous for his loyalty to the emperor Zhou. When the emperor is usurped and Fang is asked by the new one to write an inaugural address, well, Fang refuses. It's also ancient China, so realistically he knows exactly what refusal means, so that proves how metal his decision was. Even when threatened with family extermination, Fang showed his IDGAF attitude and is reported saying, "Never mind 9 agnates, go ahead with 10. Blowing steam out the ears, the emperor says, "Bet." And so Fang becomes perhaps the only case of extermination of 10 agnates in the history of China. So quite literally, in addition to his own execution, the blood relations from all 9 branches of his family hierarchy were killed. And as a kick to the nuts, his students and peers were added to be the 10th group. Random people unrelated to him who just happened to attend his lectures or work with the guy. Although altogether 873 people are said to have been executed. Because this guy refused to write a speech and when threatened said, "Do it bro, I dare you." Before death, Fang was forced to watch his brother's execution, and then Fang himself was executed by waist cutting. And legend goes that prior to his death, he dipped his finger in his own blood and wrote on the ground the Chinese character Quan, which means usurper. Man was petty until the end and took 873 people with him to prove it. Also, they liked writing in blood a lot. Number 10 is got your nose and your ears and a couple other limbs, because ancient civilization globally shared the unique agreement in the removal of someone's nose, ears, or both as the punishment for a crime. Tokugawa era Japan is no different. While flogging was a common penalty for crimes such as thefts, fighting, public intoxication, etc., amputation of the nose or ears or both replaced flogging as a penalty very early in this time, which it didn't last. This period of Japan follows a particularly violent one, and in the time of Tokugawa, they repealed a lot and calmed a lot of the criminal punishment laws from before. Regardless, commit the crime and pay the fine with mutilation. People who experienced this punishment were socially marked for their crime and were banished from hiding it. No big deal for those who had already been punished with exile and accompaniment of mutilation of their nose and ears. Female culprits of crimes that were punishable with mutilation, however, were never mutilated, but they were ordered to parade through the village naked. So I mean, pick your poison. Speaking of a woman having to pick her poison, number 9 is the tobacco ordeal. This is one of the most fascinating trial and ordeals that I have come across in my time researching. While there isn't much information, what little there is unique to say the least. So, a woman who has committed a crime goes through trial and ordeal the way that a man would, but often has different and less visceral ordeals. A favored way was the tobacco ordeal. A woman would be made to smoke several pipes full of tobacco, and the ash of the pipe was to be put into a cup of water as she did. No ash was to be spilled anywhere but the cup. This water and ash combo would be mixed together by a finger or spoon, and once the woman has finished her appointed number of pipes, she would have to drink the full cup of water. It was believed any woman who could smoke the tobacco and drink the ash water without feeling sick or dizzy was an innocent woman. Anyone who could not was guilty. Guilty of being a normal person, because who is drinking out of an ash cup and not feeling like death after? But anyways. Number 8 is the world's uncoolest face tat. Your parents could be disappointed about that face tat you chose, but imagine how much more disappointed they would have been if it was a government issued one smack dab in the center of your forehead. Tattooing in Japan can be traced back to 14,000 BC to 300 AD, when they were believed to hold a mystical significance. Afterwards, the culture moved away from tattoos well until the Edo period, where it came back in a very different way. For some duration of the time, a stamp-like forehead tattoo was the go-to punishment for a non-violent offender, like a thief, a loiterer, a vandal, whatever. It was classified as a type of corporal punishment like flogging was. Now usually it came with expulsion, which unlike exile doesn't kick you from the whole town, but it can kick you from your previous neighborhood. It was a fantastic record-keeping tab, however, as the tattoos were chosen by each region and was unique to them, making criminals from other areas identifiable. In most societies, if a tattooed criminal reoffended, they did receive the death penalty. However, some of the civilizations had 3 strikes, then you're out system. In 1745, tattooing replaced the previously discussed facial mutilation as society became gentler and less bloodthirsty. This continued over the years, with face tattooing changing to the less embarrassing and quite fashionable by today's standards arm tattoo. In 1872, the newly established government of Japan abolished the tattoo penalty for once and all. Let's get uncomfortable with number 7, the stake ordeal. This fun ordeal starts with 2 large vertical stakes driven into the ground on one of Tokugawa's 3 execution grounds. There would be multiple sets of these stakes depending on the height and weight of accused facing the stakes. This is because the body was to be stretched taut between the 2 stakes, tied by the wrist and the ankle joints. They start with the wrists to suspend the body and make it easier to tie the ankles, but once the victim was up on those stakes, their weight was all on them. Anyone tied up in this torturous fashion was forced to remain this way until they either confessed or, well, died somehow. Hanging by the hair of the head was another staking ordeal. Obviously, this wasn't something doable for someone without long hair, but worry not, as long hair was cultivated between both sexes, so there was never any shortage of torture options. While held aloft by 2 others, someone would tie the victim's long hair into a knot at the top of the stake frame. So, once they're tied, they let the weight of the person all hang from that hair until they confessed, or something uncomfortable to imagine happens. So, number 6 is gonna make me even more nauseous. It's tendon cutting. This makes me very squeamish. I'm gonna go fast. A customary punishment before and during the Edo was to cut the Achilles tendon of both feet. This was to maim a person for the rest of their life. No hunting, no working, heck, it couldn't walk in most cases, and you lost muscle connectivity that even aided in hip motion. This punishment makes you depend solely on others for the necessity of life. Seeing as this was usually a punishment for manslaughter or a passion killing, your family would have very likely disowned you anyways, leaving you alone to figure this out. One documented account is of an old man who had to move his body by dragging his legs using his hands and carrying 2 small blocks of wood in each to protect them as he did. If your tendons were spared, it was only to be exiled from your home and city forever, or to be executed. Anatsurushi is number 5. The Japanese were incredibly determined to keep Christian colonialists out of their nation. They represented imperialism, and they were known to be dangerous outsiders, bringing foreign diseases and unnecessary wars and politics. Essentially, they didn't come quietly, they came quite noisily and bossily, and the Japanese just weren't feeling that. Now, the method they chose actually turned out to be incredibly effective and withheld Christianity from the country for far longer than many others had. This is because it was a wildly brutal method. Anatsurushi was used in the 17th century to coerce Christians to recant their faith after entering Japan. Victims would be hung upside down, suspended by their feet, and often lowered into a hole, itself often filled with excrement at the bottom. A cut would be made in the forehead around the temple area in order to let the blood pressure decrease in the area around their head. The aim was to break their resolve to renounce their faith, or they would eventually die. For this reason, one of their hands would be left free and exposed so they may signal upwards a willingness to recant. Both Japanese and Western Christians are known to have been submitted to this torture. Sometimes there was a doctor around just to resuscitate them so they can continue being tortured. They were also subjected to head-down crucifixion and water crucifixion. Water style was carried out by putting an upside-down cross at the shoreline low enough that at low tide and waiting for the tide to rise so that the person would eventually drown. Christians were treated this way until 1873, when Christianity was finally allowed into Japan. And since we're already on the topic, number 4 is crucifixion. While it's unclear when crucifixion was introduced into Japan, likely 12th to 16th century, it had already had a 2,000-year history when they did. So the Japanese added some of their own twists to it, as you heard previously with the mention of an upside down or a water crucifixion. It was one of the 3 executions reserved for the worst of offenders. Alongside beheading and hanging, sometimes the 3 punishments would be mixed and matched. For example, crimes against individuals of higher social status and against family members or one's master could result in beheading prior to crucifixion. Adultery, theft, and subterfuge are all crucifiable offenses, as they threatened both the social and political order. The person to be crucified would be carried out on horseback nude, adding to the humiliation of their sentence. He'd be poked and prodded with staffs by the assigned guards, who would also carry a large banner with the person's name, offense, and punishment. Oh yeah, they aired your dirty laundry on the march to your grave. This route would also be set to pass the accused residence, as well as the location of their crime scene. The accused was then tied at the execution site, and when the cross was risen and mounted with the accused tied upon it, the guards used their staffs to spear him repeatedly until a final thrust to the throat for an ending blow. The boiling point is number 3. Large cauldrons were used by the Japanese for boiling fish to retrieve oil, preparing rice, soups, and cooking people alive. This particular torture was a remnant of the Warring States period that I've mentioned to come before Tokugawa. They were completely masochismic in that time period. The Tokugawa Empire saw that and ended quite a few of these punishments because of it. But not at first. This is why I can tell you how the Tokugawa would fill these jumbo-sized cauldrons with cold water and put it over a blazing fire. As the water began to warm, the accused would be told, hop on in. What starts as an arguably nice toasty bath begins to boil. The accused is to remain in hot water until they confessed. Now, this was only used as an ordeal when the judge and jury were very convinced of a person's guilt, but the person just wasn't fessing up. It could sometimes also constitute as a mode of punishment or execution. For example, an entire family in the 16th century were boiled alive in a gigantic bathtub as a punishment for a failed assassination. Another fun ordeal was using a pan of boiling water and having the accused dip their arm into it. If they refused to do it, they were assumed guilty. If they did and got burned, they were also assumed guilty. Only if you could stick your arm in boiling water and come out unscathed are you innocent, because that makes sense. Number 2, we pull the saw. Or don't. Don't will sound better in a second. So, like a few others on this list, the Tokugawas let this torturous execution method from the past dynasty enter into theirs. However, they made some changes in the brutality of it. But before this change, this execution method allowed for an interactive experience. So, step right up, boys and girls, who is twisted enough to slowly saw at the head of a man buried alive. In a book by Louis Froy regarding Japanese history, he describes the grisly execution of a samurai/bounty hunter. The man had attempted to claim a bounty target, but missed his shot. While he had escaped, it wasn't for long. He was captured and identified, and he was sentenced to the pulling the saw. The man had been buried up to his neck, and a saw set up next to him, with the signboard inviting passerbys to cut at his neck, slowly hacking the man's head off alive. Now, traditionally, this saw is also placed close enough to the victim's throat that the accused, while buried alive, could make the decision to speed up the process if they really wanted to. But like I said, changes were made. Metal saws, they were replaced with bamboo ones, and rather than being used to actually saw off the living's heads as they once were, they were now simply put on public display next to the condemned person for periods of days prior to their execution by other means. And number 1 is the painful honor seppuku, which literally translates means self-disembowelment. So before I unpack that statement, there are 2 forms of this execution: voluntary and obligatory. Voluntary is pretty rare. Circumstances such as warriors defeated in battle awaiting execution by their enemies and not wanting the dishonor of that. Meanwhile, obligatory seppuku refers to the method of capital punishment for samurai to spare them the disgrace of being beheaded by a common executioner. This form of execution was ritualized as a result. Great emphasis is put on the proper performance of the ritual. It's to be carried out in the presence of one or more witnesses sent by an authority who had issued the execution. While kneeling, the samurai would take a small dagger or short sword from a small table placed before him. The proper method, developed over several centuries, was plunging this weapon into your left abdomen, drawing the blade up laterally to the right, and then turning it upwards. A truly exemplary samurai would then remove the blade and push it into his sternum across the first cut and then up to pierce the throat. This is a brutally painful and extremely slow death to experience. Weirdly, for this twisted reason, it was favored by the warrior code used by the samurai as an effective way to demonstrate the courage, self-control, and strong resolve of the samurai, and to prove the sincerity of purpose even when facing their own crimes. Women of the samurai class also committed ritual takings of lives, but instead of slicing the abdomen, they slashed their throat with a short sword or dagger. A little easier on the girlies, I guess.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have scaphism. Alright, you guys, this one is also known as the boats, or being eaten alive. And really, whatever way you swing it, it absolutely sucks so badly. This is an ancient method of execution that involved putting someone sandwiched between 2 boats stacked on top of one another. From here, they'll feed the person and cover them in milk and honey, and then they just leave them. From here, the substances on and in the person will fester and attract bugs and other small vermin, which will then basically eat that person who can't fend for themselves alive. Not only would being eaten alive alive be one of the worst ways to go, but this process was incredibly lengthy and ensured the person suffered for a really long time. Like, we're talking over 10 days here. In one of the first written mentions of scaphism, which comes from Plutarch in the life of Artaxerxes, while talking about the execution of Mithridates, he said, quote, "When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and, as it were, growing to his inwards. In this way, Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired." So, yeah, anyway, if Plutarch wants to go pay for my therapy after that, I'd be really grateful. In our number 9 spot today, we have drawn and quartered. This was a popular form of punishment and became the statutory penalty for men who were convicted of high treason in the Kingdom of England from 1352, although this form of punishment certainly existed well before that. Basically, whoever the convicted was, they would be secured to some sort of wooden panel and then drawn by horse to wherever this whole thing was going down. That wasn't said casually to make light of this horrible punishment, I'm just uncomfy, so I'm trying to keep it cool and casual. So once at the place of execution, the person would then be hanged, almost to the point of them losing their life, but from there they would then be emasculated, for lack of a better term, disemboweled, beheaded, and then quartered, or chopped into 4 pieces. Alright, and because this simply wasn't enough for some insane reason, the pieces would then be displayed in prominent places across the country. Like, no, I do not want to see someone's upper right quadrant while going for breakfast. I'll pass on that. Thank you so much though. In our number 8 spot today, we have Mazzatello. This one was a method of capital punishment that was occasionally used by the Papal States for only some of the most terrible crimes, or crimes that were considered especially loathsome. Basically, the person who was being executed would be led to a scaffold that was located in the public square, because they didn't have Netflix back then, so instead they just watched people die. I don't know, it was weird. I'll keep watching Ginny and Georgia instead. But anyway, the person would be accompanied by a priest, and on this scaffold would lie a coffin and a masked executioner who was dressed in black. A prayer would be said for the soul of the condemned, and then when the time came, the executioner would swing a mallet into the air and then bring it down on the head of the prisoner. Sometimes this one blow would be enough to take their lives, and sometimes it would merely render them unconscious, which would then lead to their throat being cut. None of this sounds good. This one sucks so bad. I feel bad giving you guys this information. Next video, can it be like top 10 nice, cool, wonderful flowers or something instead? Top 10 dogs. Let's do that. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Blood Eagle. This messed up thing was a ritual method of execution that was detailed in late skaldic poetry. In the 2 instances where this horrible punishment was mentioned, the victims, who both happened to be members of the royal family, were placed in the prone position. They were laying flat on their tummies, they had their ribs severed from their spine using a sharp tool, and then they had their lungs pulled out through the opening to create a sort of super messed up and really scary and terrifying pair of wings. Both instances where this insane punishment is said to have happened, the person was being punished for patricide, or for killing their own father, so I guess definitely don't do that. I'm not really sure what the takeaway from this one is, other than, wow, that sounds horrible and I'm really glad we don't do that anymore. I also really love my dad. In our number 6 spot today, we have keel hauling. This is a word that I wish I could erase from my vocabulary, as it has to do with one of the most terrible punishments I've ever heard of, but I mean, I guess we've already talked about a bunch of these, so I should be used to it by now. The word for this punishment comes from the Dutch word keelhalen, which apparently means to drag along the keel, and that is exactly what this terrible method was all about. This punishment was usually reserved for sailors, and they would be stripped, tied, and suspended by rope from the mast of the ship with weights tied to their legs. The rope would be looped beneath the ship so that once the tied up sailor is released, they'd be dragged under the keel of the ship. In the world of the most unsurprising news ever, this method had basically a 100% fatality rate. Wow, it's almost as if you put someone in that situation that threatens their life in multiple ways, they just might not survive. How strange. In our number 5 spot today, we have the ducking stools. This was a punishment used in the 16th and 17th century England in New England, and it was usually a punishment that was reserved for women. This punishment was given to a woman for doing what was considered unwomanly, whatever that is supposed to mean. Apparently this included things like having an argument with their husband, fighting with the neighbors, gossiping, and backstabbing. Whoever made these rules had clearly never met a man, because newsflash, everyone does literally all of those things. But hey, clearly the logic used in the past was not logical. Basically, this punishment would see a woman being tied up to a stool and then dropped into a lake or stream over and over again. This was actually a punishment method that didn't usually end up in death, but that sounds like the worst consolation prize of all time. In our number 4 spot today, we have Trial by Ordeal. This one is aptly named because it really was a whole entire ordeal, and one that I'm sure absolutely none of us would have liked to have been a part of. This foolproof ancient judicial practice was used as a test to determine whether someone was innocent or guilty. Spoiler alert, it was in fact not foolproof at all. In fact, it makes absolutely zero sense. Basically, the accused would be placed in the center of everyone, and they would have severe pain inflicted upon them in a multitude of ways. If they survived the pain, they were innocent, and if they didn't, they were guilty. Like, what kind of insanity is that? Apparently, there were a multitude of different ordeals people could be subjected to, like cold water, hot iron, really whatever option, they were all bad. What an insane idea to test someone's innocence. I'm just saying, I know a lie detector test is only 80 to 90% accurate, but I'll take that over this ordeal. In our number 3 spot today, we have death by elephants. There's a lot of messed up punishments we've talked about, but this one makes me extra angry because why do we need to include poor innocent animals in our terrible behavior? You know what I mean? Execution by elephant was quite a popular method of capital punishment in certain parts of the world. The elephants would be used to crush, dismember, or just inflict pain on captives who were being publicly executed. This method was most commonly used by royalty because it was a way they could use the elephants to signify both the ruler's power as well as their ability to control a wild animal. This practice began to die out in the 18th and 19th century as the parts of the world that used this method began to be colonized. Elephants were the chosen animal in part because of their size and strength, but also because of their intelligence, domesticability, and versatility. Although bears and lions were more popularly used in other parts of the world, elephants had the ability to be trained to execute the person in a variety of different ways because they are so smart. I feel bad for the people who died like this, but I also feel really bad for the elephants who were forced to take part as well. In our number 2 spot today, we have the breaking wheel. Alright folks, buckle up for this one that was once used as a method of capital punishment. This method was most commonly used in Europe from antiquity through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. This was a super simple device and it really was just a wheel, but it was absolutely terrible. There are 2 different methods with the breaking wheel. Either the person would be broken on the wheel or by the wheel. So basically, excuse the gruesome descriptions, but if you were broken by the wheel, basically you'd be placed belly down on a board, and then the wheel was slammed down twice on each arm and leg and then on the spine. You'd then be tied to the wheel and hammered to a pole. The pole would be put up for the victim to be left up there to die. Yeah. I know I said it was gruesome, and we still have another one to get through. Being broken on the wheel involved the limbs of the victim being tied to the wheel and then smashed with a club, and in some places the wheel would spin, just to add a little extra terribleness. The number and the sequence in which the smashes were distributed were not random, however, as they were actually determined in a court sentencing. Alright, let's keep going, we're almost done. In our number 1 spot today, we have rats. Man, this one really sums up how terrible human beings can be. Rat torture originated in ancient Rome, and ever since then it unfortunately has been a part of the most horrible, gruesome punishments. What was once called a rat trap involved a man being tied down to something and then a metal enclosure being strapped to his abdomen or chest. Inside this enclosure there were rats, which the strapped down person can feel walking around, and this is when the person instilling the punishment begins heating the other end of the metal enclosure. Historically, hot coals were usually placed on top, which of course very quickly creates a hot environment for the rats inside. From here, the rats begin frantically searching for a way out, because just like us, they have survival instincts. The metal enclosure is too hard to bite into, but a human's flesh is not. Well, you see where this is going. I don't need to say more, but just know that it is very, very painful and very, very horrible. And to make matters worse, this is only one of the terrible rat punishments there have been throughout history. So maybe if there's a part 2 of this video, we'll talk about another one. How fun would that be?
Is the elephant. Those same guys that you watch paint at the zoo or roll around in the mud are the same hardcore MFs that used to be weapons of war in South and Southeast Asia. While elephants were no strangers to the battlefields, they were a common capital punishment method as well, called the gungareo. As they were smart and easily trainable, they could be used to crush, dismember, or overall torment captives in very public death sentences. The earliest record of death via elephant dates back to the classical period. However, the practice was already well established by that time and continued well into the 19th century. The most common way that the execution by elephant was carried out was the obvious: crush its victim to death with brute force. But elephants were even sometimes used in a kind of trial by ordeal, where the condemned prisoner is released if he manages to fend off the elephant for long enough. The Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end, the prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. So this obviously tells you that aside from enemy soldiers, civilians who commit certain crimes could also be punished in this brutal way. These crimes included theft, tax evasion, heresy, and rebellion. During the expedition to central India in 1868, Louis Rousselet, a French writer, photographer, and traveler, described a death sentence of a criminal by elephant. The sketch was made of the event showing the condemned being forced and placing his head on a pedestal and then being held there, while the elephant foot crushed his head. Yeah. So, punishment number 9 is branding, a global classic. Who in the ancient world wasn't branded B-words for doing stuff they didn't want them to do? Now, in Euro nations, it was usually women or servant workers getting marked up, but in India, it was also a punishment for things other than being caught with your pants down, literally. See, how they liked to do it was the culprit was branded with a hot iron, smack dab in the center of their forehead with the words describing the offense. If you stole eggs, they will brand "stole eggs" on your face, which is equally hilarious and embarrassing. So I guess the shame part would really actually work there, especially because this branding punishment always came with a reduction of social class too. This method was commonly used in classical societies. In India it was practiced during the Mughal rule, and it since has been completely abolished. Punishment number 8 is pillory. This device was shared between a few nations. The Europeans loved this crap and used it on women constantly. As you may know from the Bumblebee videos, top 10 spine-chilling ways women were punished in medieval times, part 1 and 2. If you haven't seen those, maybe go check them out on our channel and subscribe to the Hive while you're at it so you don't miss out on anything else. In pillory, the offender was compelled to stand in a public place with his head and hands locked in the iron frame so that he couldn't move. Uncomfortably hunched over, the victim would then have his ears nailed to the pillory through the top cartilage, so his head is forced up on an angle, adding to the uncomfortable position of the spine. It would essentially be like this. Then finally, the victim would be whipped, branded, or stoned. However, if the victim was super hella dangerous, I don't know, maybe he was like a top soldier turned evil but had really good battle skills and they had to be concerned about that, they'd use the pillory just to restrain him while they physically nailed the guy's actual body to a wall, then stoned them. This was practiced till the 19th century. Punishment number 7 is lost limbs. In other words, it means damaging a person severely, especially by removing a part of the body. It's another classic amongst the medieval societies, and like others who like to cut limbs off as punishment, it was usually the nose, ears, hand, or feet in India. Whatever the crime was determined the limb lost. During that period, one or both of the hands of a person were chopped off if the offender committed theft. If he indulged in intercourse offenses, such as violating someone, his privates were cut off. That one still happens nowadays, just usually once the prisoner is already in jail. Not done by the government. Anyways, back to it. If he told a lie or criticized God, his tongue would be cut off, and if he was deceitful or untrustworthy, his ears were cut off. Punishment number 6 is brain ablaze. So, in ancient India, it turns out another fun punishment was to have certain parts, but only parts, of your body set on fire. This punishment came in alongside the upheavals of ancient Indian political history, wherein kings and dynasties faced endless threats and challenges from rivals. Enough so that, like all kingdoms, violence against the king became a serious political problem that had to be dealt with ruthlessly and effectively through preemptive action, punishment, and retaliation. The punishment for one who reviles, spreads evil news about the king, or reveals council secrets is punished with tearing out the tongue, as aforementioned. More severe crimes against the king and kingdom, however, invite more severe punishments. Death by setting fire to the hands and head is a punishment for one who covets the kingdom, forces entry into the king's harem, attacks the king's palace, aids his enemies, incites forced people or enemies, or causes a rebellion in a fortified city, countryside, or army. The man is restrained, his head and hands doused in sulfur or another flammable, and Little Blaze. Punishment number 5 is blown asunder. This was the advent of British colonialists who tormented India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Blowing from a G word I can't say on YouTube involved the condemned being tied in front of a cannon so that the small of their back was forced against the muzzle. Their arms and legs would be tied behind them, the rope pulled taut enough that it curves their limbs back behind them uncomfortably. The cannon would then be fired, pretty much obliterating the prisoner's abdominal portion and blowing them in half. Bonus points for all the guts raining down on everyone. One contemporary observer reported that a head was blown almost 50 feet in the air once, and limbs sometimes landed 100 yards away, and the rest of the body essentially just vaporized. Punishment number 4 is torn apart. Another colonial classic. This style of death sentence is found everywhere from Rome to medieval Britain to Persia. For those unfamiliar with this punishment, you'd have your 4 limbs tied either between 2 horses, one holding both arm ropes and holding both leg ropes, or it'd be 1 horse for each of your limbs. At the count of 3, all horseback riders would take off in opposite directions and rip the person in the center apart. In ancient India, however, instead of using horses, they used oxen. For example, a law was in place that women caught killing their husbands or family members, killing others by poison, or committing arson are to be torn apart by oxen. Punishment number 3 is cooked alive. The sensation of being boiled alive was an absolutely horrific one, yet it was a punishment for things as meager as theft or lying. A large cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, fat, or molten lead and left to boil. Putting a victim in the cauldron before the boiling was done was the worst way to exert this punishment, as it meant they would probably remain conscious, and then he'd notice his eyes burning, clothes fusing with his body, and skin blistering. The limbs and extremities were the first things to burn after that. After the person's outer layers began to cook, their organs began to cook as well, and their bodily fluids rose in temperature so they were also boiling inside. All who went through this medieval death could only pray for a fast and merciful one, but boiling to death was unfortunately a very slow process. A quick death would only come, as said, if the liquid was already boiling when the victim is dunked in. If it wasn't and they wanted to speed up their own deaths, the victim could always duck their head underneath the liquid and just boil their own brain that way. But otherwise, it was long and horrific until the very end. While this should have been reserved for only the worst offenders, it soon became a go-to death sentence for foragers of all people. In India, it was said in the Garuda Puranam that the people who didn't offer food to orphans and contaminated food are boiled in oil after their death. In 1606, Guru Arjan of the Sikhs was boiled alive as a form of torment and subsequently died on the orders of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Punishment number 2 is exposure. While this was less common in ancient India, it was part of other punishments such as pillory, whipping posts, or stocks, or it was used as a method of gaining confession. Victims could be exposed to the elements by restraining them somewhere outside, whether on the ground, which was more susceptible to bugs, pests, animals, and grime, or somewhere suspended, like a cage, off a wall. That one was popular in Europe. In summer, the guards could just pour hot water over the victim's head repetitively, which eventually increased body temperatures to the extent that heat stroke would take effect, causing a victim to die slowly and painfully. Sometimes the body was even left to decay publicly to dissuade any further crimes. During cold days and nights, the chill, as well as the lack of protection from the wind, could easily sap a victim's body heat. Alternatively, the victim could be buried up to his neck, letting any animals, insects, or other people kill him slowly the way they want to. Due to its cost efficiency and cruelty, the exposure torment strategy was widespread in medieval Europe and many other places. In many cases, the victim was sentenced to a short period of exposure depending on the crime. However, death was frequent since they were completely defenseless, even if it wasn't intended to be more than a 2-day punishment. You never know. Punishment number 1 is immurement. However, it is more identifiable to the common person if I just call it being buried alive. Placing someone into a confined space and then sealing it up so they're forced to wait for their own death, whether it comes from dehydration, starvation, or even asphyxiation. Immurement also had been performed for aesthetic reasons in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, and examples can be found in plenty of written sources. The year is 1660 and the place is India. On the 6th of May, Shah Shuja, the second son of the Mughal emperor, boarded a ship and sailed from Dhaka to Arachne to find asylum from his brother, who was now his father's successor and wanted to kill him. Shah's plan was to stay in Arachne for a short period before sailing over to Mecca, then Persia. But he landed there just as the monsoon season hit, and it trapped the prince in Arachne for many months. And then, for life. See, while stuck there, the king asked Shah if his eldest daughter would marry his son. For some reason, this really grilled Shah's onions, and he tried to overthrow the Attican king in a coup, which then was found out. Although Shah managed to escape into the jungle, he was subsequently caught and put to death. The prince's family, however, were thrown into prison after their capture, although they were set free later. Moreover, the king married Shah's eldest daughter himself. He didn't even give her to her son, really just spit on dad's grave like that. It seems like the surviving family members of Shah, including that eldest daughter, plotted to seize power again and overthrow the king, having clearly learned nothing. Like the last time the conspiracy was leaked, and this time the king meant business. If his family was gonna keep being a problem, he was just gonna exterminate the entire thing. According to the 17th century French physician and traveler Francois Bernard, the men were decapitated with axes, whilst the women were closed, confined in their apartments, left to die of hunger. All the windows and doors had been sealed. Even Shah's eldest daughter, now the king's wife, was not spared.
Number 10, the Judas Cradle. Right off the hop, we'll start with a bad one. I mean, they're all pretty bad, but this one is so specific, you know what I mean? This is a brutal torture device used in the medieval ages to punish those who were accused of adultery or blasphemy. Yeah, adultery. This is what would happen to you. Imagine this. The victim would be placed on top of a pyramid-shaped seat, not really a seat at all, just a sharp pyramid, and they'd be slowly lowered onto it by ropes. Now, the pointed tip of said seat/pyramid would penetrate their anything in this region at all bad, all rough time. And this, of course, would often lead to death due to infection. The Judas Cradle was painful, it was intimate, and it was slow. It was horrible. It was considered an effective way of obtaining confessions from suspects. Even if they were innocent, they're like, sure, I did it. Get me off of this thing. What the fuck? This painful and gruesome method of punishment is thankfully no longer in use today, obviously, but occasionally I'm gonna pop up and remind you not to forget about it. It's horrible. The Justice Department has things to fix today, sure, I'll say that, but at least we're not lowering the accused onto the chair of death. Let's leave that one in the past. Number 9, the choke pear. Great name, already looking forward to this one. Also known as the Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a medieval punishment device used to humiliate its victims, really. The device was inserted into the victim's mouth, or again, other places, and then slowly expanded open using a screw mechanism until it reached its full size. Yeah, almost like something from Saw, just like that, exactly. This caused immense pain and often resulted in permanent injury or, of course, as you can imagine, death. The choke pear was also used to extract confessions from suspects or prisoners. Despite its gruesome nature, the choke pear actually remained in use for centuries and was only officially banned in the 19th century. Yeah, you're like, what is this, ancient Egypt, Rome, Greek, what is this? No, it's like 200 years ago. Today, examples of the device can be found in museums, so if you see something that looks kind of like a choke pear, they're all fancy for some reason. Take a minute and reflect on these horrors. They used to punish men for homosexuality with a choke pear. Humans are disgusting. Number 8, scaphism. First used in ancient Persia. The victim here would be stripped naked and placed inside of 2 hollowed out tree trunks, or sometimes boats. But only their heads, hands, and feet were exposed. You were literally stuck in a tree. Now, if that's not already uncomfortable and haunting in the hot sun already, they would then be force-fed honey and milk until they were extremely ill. And of course, all of that happening in tight quarters inside of a tree trunk. Well, as time passed, maggots would eat away at the victim's flesh, causing infections and gangrene. And also, it's horrible. It's so uncomfortable. The process could take days or even weeks to kill the victim. This method of punishment was meant to be slow and painful. And of course, the typical ancient fashion, it was very public. Everyone came out to watch, serving as a warning to others who may have committed similar crimes that somehow deserve being stuck in a tree. No way. Number 7, the punishment of non-existence. Ooh, this one's pretty good. It's different, but it's definitely worth a mention on our list today. When we talk about pharaohs or pretty much anything from ancient history, we know nothing. I mean, really, so many books destroyed, that much time passed. There's countless leaders that we know nothing of, and it has a little something to do with damnatio memoriae. Damnatio memoriae was a practice in ancient Rome that involved erasing the memory of an individual or group from history. Just ever gone. Control Alt Delete. See you later, Brad. This was done by destroying any and all physical evidence of their existence, such as statues or inscriptions, and banning the use of their name. That's incredible. It was typically used to punish individuals who had committed treason or other crimes against the state, but it could also be applied to those who were, well, simply unpopular with the ruling class. Yeah, getting canceled, but in ancient Rome. There we go. Some guy's scratching your face out of a rock. He's like, nah, you don't exist anymore, buddy. How's that sound? That's horrible. That is so, I mean, cutting to 2023 now, yeah, they're gone. We have no idea who they are. The effectiveness of this varied depending on the circumstances. I mean, in some cases, it succeeded in erasing the memory or the group completely, while in others, it only generated more interest in them. Know what I mean? You cancel somebody now today and you're like, well, who are these people? What did they do? Today we do this, but it's just, you know, blocking somebody on socials. Mute. See ya. Number 6, Iron Maiden. Great, now Run to the Hills. It's gonna be stuck in my head all day. Not bad, honestly not bad. Hit the thumbs up for the Iron Maiden band. Not for this content, just for the band. Iron Maidens were tricky. An Iron Maiden was a device used in the Middle Ages, and it was an upright coffin-shaped humanoid-looking box with spikes on the inside that would puncture the victim when they were placed inside and had that big scary door closed. The spikes were long enough to cause significant pain and injury, but not long enough to kill the victim immediately. Ergo, horribleness. The victim would be left inside for hours or even days, slowly succumbing to their injuries and eventually dying from infection or, well, just blood loss. This method of punishment was considered cruel due to its prolonged nature and the physical torment that it inflicted on the victim. Because yeah, even without the spikes inside, this one would drive me nuts. Oh, terrifying. It's like the movie Buried, but somehow worse. Number 5, Trial by Ordeal. Trial by Ordeal of water was insane. It's honestly hilarious to think of. It was a medieval method of determining guilt or innocence. Now the accused would be thrown into a body of water, often a river or a pond, something dirty back then, and if they floated, well, it was believed that God was protecting them and that they were innocent. But if they sank, however, well, they were deemed guilty. They were naughty, right? This practice was based on the belief that water, being a pure element created by the Lord, would reject impurities such as sin. And it was also thought that drowning was an acceptable punishment for those who were deemed guilty. Because, yeah, sure. The trial by ordeal of water was widely used throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and continued until the early modern period. So yeah, it lasted a while. However, it was eventually abolished due to its high mortality rate and, well, lack of reliability in determining guilt or innocence. It was a bunch of bullshit. Who knew? Water rejects impurities. That would be jarring. You try and have a bath, you just get launched out. You're like, oh, okay then. Gotcha. Heard. Number 4, the lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler device dates back to medieval times, as all these great gadgets do, and it was used as a form of punishment for those who committed crimes such as heresy or treason. The device consisted of a hollow metal sphere with a long handle. It looks like something you'd get from Elden Ring. It's like a weird looking wand, I don't know. It was then filled with molten lead or boiling oil. You already know where I'm going with this one. The Punisher would then hold the sphere over the victim's naked body, always naked again, and then allow the hot liquid to drip through small holes onto your skin, causing severe burns and excruciating pain. Now, over time, variations of the lead sprinkler were developed, including ones with multiple spouts to, increase the amount of liquid being poured onto victim or victims. Yeah, they got creative. Just the thing you want to hear in this kind of list. They toyed around with some ideas, sure. Number 3, the guillotine. A classic, not quite ancient, but we gotta mention it. First seen in France during the late 18th century as an alternative to other forms of capital punishment, all those other horrible versions. Those were seen as cruel and inhumane, but this one, dare I say, changed the game. It quickly became the preferred method of execution in France and was used extensively throughout the French Revolution to execute thousands of people, including King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The guillotine's popularity spread throughout Europe, with several countries adopting it as their primary means of capital punishment. They're like, hey, that looks pretty cheap and horrible, let's do that. It continued to be used until the mid-20th century when most countries abolished capital punishment altogether. Now, despite its gruesome reputation, some argue that the guillotine was a humane method of execution because it was quick and painless compared to the other 9 that I've mentioned on this list. Oh my god. Number 2, the thumbscrew. This one, for some reason, this one hits me the most. Thumbscrews were a method of inflicting pain by crushing the fingers or the toes, or sometimes the knees. They would make massive thumbscrews. Knee screws, almost. The victim's digits were inserted into the screw and then it was slowly tightened, causing, of course, excruciating pain and potentially permanent damage. This form of punishment was commonly used during medieval times, of course, and as means of extracting information. Yeah, if you do that to me, I'll say anything in 4 minutes or less. It was also seen during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions from those suspected of heresy. Thumbscrews were often made of iron or brass and could be adjusted to increase or decrease pressure on your body. Anywhere. Like I said earlier, they would get creative with where they would put these screws of death. Not good. Despite its brutal nature, thumbscrew torture remained in use for centuries before eventually falling out of favor due to its, well, extreme cruelty. At what point do you decide, right? Like some guy's like, you know what? It's a little bit too much. Let's get this one. We're just gonna put him in the coffin for now. Thumb screws are so old. And finally, number 1, cement shoes. We'll end on a 20th century mafia punishment because why not, all right? I wrote the thing. I can talk about what I want. Let's do it. You made it this far too. We'll end on a not horrible one. Cement shoes involved placing the victim's feet in, well, as you could guess, buckets filled with wet concrete, which then of course hardens around their feet. Science right there, that's how that works. Unless you have a moving truck thing, then that cement's gonna dry pretty fast. At that point, you're unable to move or escape, and the victim is then thrown into a body of water to sink down and drown. This brutal technique was popularized by organized crime groups and mafias and stuff like that back in the early 20th century as a way to dispose of informants or those who had betrayed the group. Betrayed the mafia. The first recorded use of cement shoes was in New York City in 1935 when 2 victims were found dead with their feet encased in concrete.
Number 10, Ray Romano. While listening to Ray Romano's voice for hours on end may be one of the harshest punishments ever conceived. Seriously, I wouldn't want to do that. What I was actually referring to was his portrayal of the woolly mammoth in Ice Age. Yes, the large tusked beast of the forgotten era. They were tough, and if crossed would surely spell the end of any Neanderthal brave enough to face one alone, which I'm sure at some point was. Cause trouble in the tribe? Well, then you have to bring us dinner, and we're hungry, so please go single-handedly and hunt and bring back a woolly mammoth. I couldn't even imagine. Unfortunately for those Neanderthals, this isn't Star Wars, and they weren't Boba Fett. Bringing back the head of a beast single-handed wasn't going to happen. They were most likely going to get trampled and left for archaeologists left to find thousands of years later. Yeah, no thanks. Number 9. Cliff. While the Neanderthals might not have been as smart as their Homo sapien counterparts, they were not exactly idiots. You find a high enough cliff, and you push said banished member off the cliff. It's simple, but effective. There's a good chance that whomever gets pushed off said cliff will not cause trouble for the tribe any longer. This is something that many civilizations would do for many years. The Greeks, the Romans, just about everyone really. You can't blame them either. It's cheap and quick, and if the cliff or ledge is high enough, you don't ever have to worry about cleaning up. Although I wouldn't do it in a pit like the Spartans. That would just fill up too quickly. And no shot that was the first time that Leonidas kicked a dude in the pit, let's be honest. Is there someone who empties the hole later? Cliffs are just easier. Just easier. Number 8, ear infections. Okay, not exactly a punishment, but it could be a punishment from up above. Hear me out. Not exactly sure who did this to the Neanderthals. Maybe it was God, maybe it was evolution, maybe it was something else. But the Neanderthals were cursed with something that I don't ever want to experience again. Shout out to the people who don't want to put their head underwater because after about 5 hours, the bonfire on the beach isn't so fun with your friends because you have an ear infection. Yes, that's right, ear infections. I'm sure I just described someone's least favorite summer night. Well, according to a study in 2019, ear infections were common in Neanderthals and may have ruined many meals by the fireside. While humans like us eventually grow out of them due to our ears' insides growing larger as we grow older, the inside of Neanderthals' ears stayed small and were a perfect place for bacteria. And like most folks, you're not you when you're hungry. You're also not you if you can't hear the Arctic monkeys playing by the bonfire because of a really bad ear infection. Honestly, if you ever had one, I'm just sorry. Number 7. Stick. This should come as no surprise, but a lot of problems or punishments were probably dealt with in the almighty stick. Cheap, somewhat effective, and in good supply. There's tons of expression for who's got the bigger stick, but like General Shepard from Modern Warfare 2 said, it also depends on who's swinging it. We'll never really know who was the first human-like creature to pick up a stick and wave it, but what we do know is that sticks are a part of everyday life, like tools and hunting. The sticks can also make for an excellent punishment delivering device. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but names can never hurt me. Well, maybe sometimes. Honestly, the only time I've ever been really hurt is when the world lost Harambe. Rest in peace, you silverback angel. Life's never been the same since. Number 6. Rock. And you smell what the Rock is cooking. Man, I miss the old Rock. I miss the WWE. Those were just good times, weren't they? Stone Cold too, what a great guy. Speaking of rocks, probably the next best thing to a stick is a rock. Probably even cheaper and more plentiful than sticks. All kinds of punishments can be derived from rocks. Simple techniques such as having the tribe fill baskets full of rocks and then throw them at you until you're seeing stars, or just ceasing to exist. Or in a similar situation, throwing someone off of a cliff, take a semi-large rock and drop it from a large height on top of somebody's head. Methods are different, however it usually ends up in the same results. Just wait till they find out what kind of minerals and ores are hiding in those rocks. Oh, the discovery of metal and metalworking. Number 5. Good soup. Perhaps we'll never know where any of these punishments truly come from, but like all things, they had to come from somewhere. Maybe they did come from Neanderthals. What I'm talking about here is boiling people alive in oil. The good old days, which honestly sounds like the worst way to go. It just can't be nice. A practice that yet again was done all over. Giving people the lobster treatment must have been the worst looking, the worst sounding, and the worst smelling way to unalive someone. I happen to be a lover of theater, but man, this is a little too much. It's hard to call this anything but theatrics, as I'm sure there were much easier ways to achieve certain goals. Honestly, you could probably cough on someone and would achieve the same result. Boy, am I thankful for sanitation. Number 4, sacrifice. When your source of food gets taken away and then the rain doesn't stop for 6 days and 6 nights, and when your favorite VHS no longer works, it can truly only be an act of God. We have to please him. Set a bunch of ooga booga men around the campfire. But how do we do this? Well, that's usually when the quiet person in the back speaks up. Sacrifice someone to the gods, he says. Alright, sounds good to me. This was something that went on in many cultures around the world, but it makes you wonder who really was the first to try it. Or rather, keep trying it. I mean, hey, the buffalo came back, the rain stopped, and I just found my favorite VHS. Dude, we gotta sacrifice more people. Number 3, the Brazen Bull. This might be the oldest punishment on the books. It also may be the worst. Seriously, this one's the worst. Similar to boiling in oil, however, this is just much worse. The Brazen Bull, basically what you got here is a bull made of bronze, and she's hollowed out like one of those walker things from Star Wars with all the little stormtroopers in it. So you put the perpetrators inside, you lock them in, and then you start a fire underneath that would essentially cook your perps to well done. Make sure your perps are well oiled and salted. Keep on high heat until the screaming stops or the desired sin has been cooked away. Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine the horrible feeling that would be locked inside there. No amount of aloe vera could ever fix those burns. Number 2, dishonored burial. You are born, you live, and then you pass away. That's life. You gotta make the best of it. And at the very end, the least you can hope for is that the people will love you and give you the proper send-off that you deserve. This was a serious deal for those in the olden times. Every culture from every corner of the world has some sort of burial and ritual rites. However, imagine if you were the tribe's disgrace. Perhaps you ate all their food, or never contributed to the tribe. Maybe you're the reason why my favorite VHS tape went missing. Well, sir or madam, for your crimes and disrespect against this tribe, when you pass on, you will not receive the proper burial rites. There's been a few cases of remains dug up different from others, which begs the question, what did the person do to deserve such dishonors? And what did they do with my favorite VHS tape? Number 1, banishment.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
In the same way that most teenagers across the country feel when they discover hair dye, punk rock, and feelings, is probably the same way Neanderthals feel when they were banished from their homes. A simple plan really, non-violent but quite effective. As you walked along the boulevard of broken dreams, you'd be searching for a new home in the brutal, cold, and scary world that was ye olde times. Not even your offspring will know you, as you may never return. Besides, you're in too deep, and you're trying to keep yourself alive with anything that you can find. The all-American rejected teenagers do this kind of isolation from the comfort of their warm, isolated bedrooms that are paid for by loving parents. The Neanderthals were serious, as leaving the safety of your numbers had many disadvantages, not being eaten by a predator for one. Stay strong, kids. Stay strong.
Number 10, thews or stalks. Gossiping now is always seen as a bothersome and terrible construct where rumors are spread and information is sent from one end to the room to the other, when in actuality the original history of gossiping was used as a survival tool since time. However, due to the trickling events that would occur in the 12th century to the 21st century, gossip has been accompanied by the dangerous stigmatization of women. And with that in mind, they would be accompanied with a crime of humiliation for gossiping by being locked up by the neck and left outside at the mercy of the mocking crowd. The thew was a type of of pillories similar to stocks specifically for women, and the woman would be chained to a post by her neck as a punishment for her crime. Unlike men, her hands weren't tied up, and common crimes include annoying your neighbors by talking too much or consummating outside of marriage. As for example, one woman named Anne Morrow in 1777, she was accused of impersonating a man and marrying another woman. She was put in the pillory and an angry crowd stoned her, and resulting of her being blind. Number 9. Iron cages. They really didn't like it when women gossiped, or in most cases talked back in the day, especially when she would speak up or just discuss things. But words can only help you unless you speak them, and it's disappointing when people fail to understand that. Women who nagged would have metal spikes forced into their mouths, and the scold bridle was an iron cage for a woman's face, used to punish scolds, women who nagged, gossiped, talked back, or just talked too much. The bridle would be locked onto your head, and the protruding piece of metal covered in spikes would be forced inside your mouth, and every time you moved your tongue, the spikes would lacerate it. Sometimes the bridal woman would be chained to a hook by the fireplace in her home until she had learned her lesson, or she might be led through town wearing the mask to increase her humiliation. Number 8. Duck the scold. Unfortunately, another form of torment and punishment for women being tied to a chair at the end of a long, maneuverable wooden arm and dipped into frigid water. The punishment wasn't designed to be fatal, although sometimes it was, but rather a humiliating spectacle aimed at discouraging whatever behavior participated in it. There were various rituals for silencing women, as they have their roots in fear of women's speech and fear that women will attack other people in their community, that they gossip too much, that their voices were dangerous, and that they may, in extreme circumstances, also be witches. Though the women who ended up being on the ducking stool risked being accused of witchcraft, and the punishment, contrary to popular misconception, wasn't used to determine whether someone was a witch. A separate test, primarily known as the swimming witch, involved throwing a bound victim into a body of water to see if they'd float, a sure sign of guilt in the modern imagination. Subjects who sank were deemed innocent but could still wind up dead if they weren't rescued from the water in time. Few records about the women who were ducked survived. Much more information is available about the ducking stools themselves, their upkeep, about how they were kept into their construction. Number 7. Marking and tattooing. Although in some cultures tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but part of their heritage and even a source of pride. But in some cases they would use it as a means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, famously marks its protagonist, Hester Prynne, with a red letter A for adultery for accusations about her behavior circulated. Hawthorne's book is more than fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crimes. Like Hester Prynne, A or the letters AD as outlined by a Plymouth colony law from 1658, adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subject to public whipping and even further humiliation and social alienation. But keep in mind, Hawthorne was the descendant of the Judge Hathorne, who persecuted the lives of women who were accused of being witches, and he had such a disdain for his relative that he had changed his last name to distance himself from the relation of Hathorne from Hawthorne with a W. Number 6. Walk of Shame. Like in Game of Thrones, a pretty well-known show, I don't know if you guys heard of it, I'm rewatching it again up to a certain specific season. But there was that scene where Cersei was condemned for her crimes and had that lady yell shame as she rung a bell while Cersei was left parading the streets stripped naked. This is actually based as a form of torment for women, and the Walk of Shame, also known as skimmington or rough music, was a traditional punishment for harlotry or being an overbearing wife. Women were made to walk barefoot through the town or city, sometimes dressed only in their petticoat. The street was filthy and sharp with rough stones, jeering crowds lined up to stare, and minstrels banging basins and pans would accompany the procession, adding to the woman's humiliation. Sometimes the skimmingtons were delivered by the townsfolk rather than the courts, and the accused might be dragged from their bed at night and paraded through the town with the crowd shouting obscene words at her. Unless she was quiet, subdued woman who followed every little thing she was supposed to do, she would be looked down on. Number 5. Status degradation. Status degradation still persists today, and it's been used as a formal punishment throughout history. Under the Roman Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noble women in the Kingdom of Korea during the Chosun dynasty faced a similar degradation of their social status if they were found guilty of adultery or if they just remarried. Adulteresses were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born statuses, and the descendants of widows who remarried were barred from holding office. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Chosun dynasty faced even graver punishment, which is death. Number 4. Pricking and scratching. Another form of torment women had to endure as a type of punishment relates back towards one of the biggest torments women had to face during the witch trials. Witch hunting books and instruction pamphlets, yes, they had an IKEA manual on how to prick a witch. It noted that marks were insensitive to pain and they couldn't bleed. So they would make these specifically designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced their desired results. So basically they would just keep poking you with needles until there was an area on you that just didn't bleed. They even had a job position for this called professional prickers, which many of them would be con men using dulled needles points to identify fake witch marks. Alongside the pricking was the scratching, where they would scratch the supposed victim, so if a victim scratches the accused witch with their fingernails and drew blood, and their symptoms of being possessed stopped, then somehow that person that they scratched was a witch. Number 3. Tar and feathering. When I first heard about tar and feathering, it was in a cartoon where the characters would use tar and then feather the characters they wanted to make a fool out of. Tar and feathering originated as a punishment that dates back to Richard I of England. The practice of tarring and feathering was exported to the Americas, gaining popularity in the mid-18th century. Throughout the 1760s, it saw increased usages as a means of protesting the Townshend Revenue Act and those who sought to enforce it. For women, they'd also tar and feather as a form of embarrassment. In a news article in 1906, consisting of 4 young married women from the East Sandy, Pennsylvania, corrected the alleged evil conduct of their neighbor, Mrs. Hattie Lowry. 2 women held Mrs. Lowry to the floor while the others 2 smeared her face with stove polish until it was completely covered, and then poured thick molasses on her head and emptied the contents of a feather pillow over molasses. The women then marched the victim to a railroad camp tied by the wrist, where 200 workmen stopped to watch the spectacle. After parading Mrs. Lowry through the camp, the women tied her to a large box where she remained until a man released her. They did this because they wanted to be part of a vigilant committee which exercises the right to take up the law in their own hands. Reason why they did that to her, though, is still unknown. Justice for Mrs. Lowry. Number 2. Amputation. Although it may not seem to be as creative as the other instruments of torture on this list, amputation packed a painful and permanent punch. The body of an ancient Chinese woman from about 3,000 years ago have been found with an amputated feet but in otherwise good health, and all signs point to an ancient Chinese punishment called yue, which was used for over 500 different offenses, including cheating and stealing. In ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire, a different type of amputation was common: nose amputation, called rhinotomy, which was a punishment for adulterous women, though it was also used as a punishment for various crimes in medieval and ancient times elsewhere. However, the adulterous man might escape with a less severe punishment like a fine or a beating. Number 1. Burnt to death. Although it is noted that the most famous form of torment and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or burn them by the stake, but this was more common in Europe during the very early 1300s to the end of the 17th century. In England and most of their colonies, the witch trials would go on like every other crime, and when someone was convicted of witchcraft, typically they would be hanged. But with the burning alive, that was more specifically used in Europe, especially in Scotland. Women accused of witchcraft and communing with the devil would be burnt, but it was also a common punishment for treason or heresy. A woman might have her limbs covered in tar, as well as being made to wear a tar-soaked dress and bonnet, and she would then be tied up by the neck on a barrel and the fire would be lit. She would be simultaneously burnt and hung in a blazing inferno, or they wouldn't bother to hang her, instead placing a bundle of twigs around her feet so she would be consumed in a sheet of fire and burnt alive. Notably, another famous person who was also in this unfortunate spectacle was Joan of Arc.